Hi, everyone. Welcome once again to the lectures of this self-knowledge course. Today, we are going to talk about some very important symbols that, interestingly, appear throughout the ancient religions and cultures of Mesoamerica. These include the symbol of a man being devoured by the serpent swallowing its own tail, the symbol of the eagle swallowing the serpent, and also the feathered serpent. We are going to discover how all this symbolism is directly related to the continuation of the work we studied when we spoke about the intimate Christ and the death of the causal eyes. The entire process represented by the eagle swallowing the serpent refers to the three final works that the Christ must accomplish on the third mountain in order to achieve self-realization. To understand this topic better, let us begin by talking about the serpent. What does the serpent symbolize, and why is it represented as a serpent? The serpent is a symbol that has been present in practically every ancient culture and religion. For example, we see the Hindu gods represented with their serpents raised. We also see representations of the Buddha in meditation with a seven-headed cobra rising behind him and covering him. This represents the fact that, in order to attain the state of enlightenment, it is necessary to raise the seven internal serpents. In Egyptian paintings, sculptures, and other representations, we see the gods with a serpent appearing on their foreheads, either directly on their heads or emerging from their crowns and headdresses. We can also see the caduceus of Mercury, the symbol of medicine. In this symbol, the central rod represents the spinal column, while the two serpents represent the energy channels, Ida and Pingala, which ascend along the spine. In this symbol of Greek origin, the serpent is an allusion to regeneration and health. What, then, does the serpent symbolize? It symbolizes transmuted sexual energy, the sacred fire of Kundalini. If we could clairvoyantly observe the sacred fire ascending through our spinal column toward the region between the eyebrows during the practice of suprasex, we would see its similarity to a cobra. This ascending sacred fire also produces a hissing sound that is very similar to the hissing of a snake. For this reason, sexual energy has always been symbolized by a serpent. The serpent has always had two different connotations, one positive and one negative. In Christianity, for example, we find both aspects of the serpent. On the one hand, we have the tempting serpent of Eden, which led humanity to its fall, and as a consequence, to the loss of its paradisiacal state. On the other hand, we have the brass, or fiery serpent, that Moses raised upon a pole and through which the Israelites were healed in the wilderness. The reason for these two aspects is that the serpent represents our sexual energy. In its positive aspect, it is the Kundalini serpent, usually represented as a royal cobra. This represents our sexual energy ascending victoriously through the spinal column, regenerating us, giving us the elixir of long life, and creating the existential bodies of our being. In its negative aspect, we have the inverted serpent represented by the Kundabuffer organ. This is the tail that we see emerging from the coccyx of the demons and devils represented in paintings and sculptures. But the truth is that we all have this tail in etheric and astral form because we fell into fornication. And as we have continued to fornicate, continually expelling our sexual energy, this tail has continued to develop. This inverted serpent, this inverted fire, is also represented by the python. The tempting serpent of Eden was, therefore, our sexual desire, which led us to fornicate and caused our fall. It is the same sexual energy that can either develop positively upward or negatively downward, depending on whether we overcome temptation or give in to it. The Kundalini serpent ascends through the spine of every white tantric. The word Kundalini means the end of the Kundabuffer organ. As we develop the Kundalini serpent, we simultaneously shorten and eliminate the Kundabuffer organ until we completely dissolve that satanic tail that forms part of our fallen nature. The serpent is, therefore, our Divine Mother Kundalini. When we achieve chastity by working on the psychological eye of fornication, balancing our energy centers, and transforming our mercury from black to red, the sacred fire awakens within us, and we receive the silver sword internally. This is when the Kundalini serpent awakens within us. But it is important to understand that awakening the Kundalini is not the end of the work. It is not enough to awaken the serpent. we must also allow ourselves to be swallowed by the serpent. When the serpent swallows us, she gives us all of her powers. But the Divine Mother does not swallow anything that is impure. Therefore, there is an entire process of purification that we must undergo before we can be swallowed by the serpent and become serpent men. The first thing we must do is create the existential bodies on the first mountain. The Divine Mother needs to devour these existential bodies in order to merge them all into a single force, the force of love. However, the existential bodies created on the first mountain are not yet completely pure. At this stage, there is still a great deal of ego within us. At the end of the first mountain, we have approximately 78% of consciousness, while the causal eyes are still alive within us. Therefore, it is necessary that the corruptible be clothed with incorruption. We must complete all the work of the second mountain, which we explained in the lecture entitled The Intimate Christ and the Death of the Causal Eyes. This is the work through which the solar bodies are transformed into bodies of gold, and through which even the last trace of the ego within us is eliminated. On this mountain, which is the mountain of death, the apocalypse takes place, the end through fire of our entire inferior nature and of the entire ego, including the very causes or seeds from which the ego originates, which are the causal eyes. The Divine Mother Kundalini must devour the existential bodies of the being. But in order for her to do this, all of these bodies must first have been transformed into pure gold, because she does not swallow anything that is impure. No one can be devoured by the serpent without first dissolving the animal ego. Whoever dissolves the ego is swallowed by the serpent, and whoever is swallowed by the serpent becomes a serpent. This is why the initiate must disintegrate the causal eyes. At the end of the second mountain, after the death of the causal eyes, we remain converted into serpent men. Without the disintegration of the causal eyes, he can never reach the doors of the Absolute. He may have incarnated the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit within himself, but before the Absolute, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are still mechanical. He cannot enter the Absolute because the ray of creation is divided into 3 laws. Therefore, he must undergo a great mystical death, through which these 3 laws are merged into a single law. The second mountain is completed with 99% of consciousness. On the third mountain, the remaining 1% of consciousness must be achieved. The fusion of 100% of consciousness is achieved when all the parts of the being become fully integrated into one. It is also necessary, during the work of the third mountain, to find a disciple who takes the direct path and reaches the second mountain. In order to liberate ourselves, we must help at least one other person to achieve self-realization. The third mountain is the mountain of sacrifice for humanity. And it is on the third mountain that the process represented by the eagle swallowing the serpent takes place. There, the 3 aspects of love are merged. The 3 aspects of fire, which are the Christ, the Holy Spirit, and Lucifer, become one, and love becomes integrated with wisdom, which is the Father. The Holy Spirit is the same Divine Mother. She is that creative force which, at this point, is ready to swallow the existential bodies. The symbol of the eagle swallowing the serpent represents the 3 great labors of the Christ on the third mountain. Therefore, there are 3 steps that the Christ must complete on the third mountain in order to bring the entire work to its conclusion and achieve self-realization. Let us look at the first step. At the end of the second mountain, after the death of the causal eyes, the serpent of fire, which is the Christ, must unite with the Holy Spirit. In this way, they become an Elohim, a male-female. This marks the beginning of the third mountain. At this stage, we become serpent men. The serpent has swallowed us, and we are transformed into androgynous beings. From this point onward, we no longer continue the work with a physical partner. The marriage with a physical partner lasts until death separates the couple. Therefore, once the entire ego has died, the work with the physical partner is completed. The initiate remains integrated with his divine soul, and it is with this divine soul that he will carry out the work of creating the bodies of light of the third mountain. In the second step, the serpent begins to absorb herself in order to form the O of the Spirit, the O of God the Mother. This is represented by the serpent swallowing its own tail, the Ouroboros. To accomplish this, the Christ defeats the dragon, Lucifer, by overcoming every temptation and then merges with him. Since the Christ has already eliminated the causal eyes, Lucifer no longer has anyone to tempt. At this point, the forces of the Holy Spirit, the Christ, and Lucifer are completely fused. God the Mother is now fully integrated. In the third and final step, the serpent, the Christ Lucifer, is devoured by the eagle, which represents the Father. In this way, the serpent becomes the feathered serpent. After all his hard work as a psychological trainer, he achieves true freedom and is left without even the slightest shadow of evil. Then the Logos, the Father, swallows and absorbs him. Wisdom becomes integrated with love. He has succeeded in crystallizing within himself the three primary forces of the universe. On the third mountain, these three forces die. This is why it is said that God himself must die. He is a God capable of creating through the Word, and yet he must pass through death. But this death is actually a transformation. It is the unification of these three forces into a single force. This is the meaning of the Aztec symbol of the eagle swallowing the serpent. It represents the passage from duality to unity. The Absolute must be entered as unity, not as trinity, and not as duality, but as unity. The three laws are absorbed and merged into one. That one law remains united with the great law and is directly connected with the Absolute through the great law, allowing the initiate to reach unity. This is total liberation. The eagle represents the spirit, while the serpent represents the fire. When the eagle swallows the serpent, we become feathered serpents, a Quetzalcoatl, and the work is completed. As we can see in this beautiful lecture, the Masters have clearly shown us the culmination of this wonderful work of self-knowledge that we came to accomplish through this physical manifestation. We can also see that throughout all cultures and all periods of history, the knowledge of this path has existed. It has been encoded in the art and symbols of different civilizations, preserved as a legacy and passed down through time. And with this, we have reached the end of the 23rd lecture of Phase B. In our next lecture, we will explain another very interesting symbol, the cross. In that lecture, we will talk about the practice of the cross and what the cross symbolizes. Remember that you can leave us any questions you may have. Thank you for participating. Until next time.